Hey guys, tonight we dive headfirst into a bedtime tale you definitely won't be reading to your kids, unless you're trying to scare them into behaving for eternity. This journey brings you face to face with some of the worst dads in medieval history and beyond. Think murder, betrayal, neglect, and a whole lot of royal daddy issues. You're not strolling through a gentle family tree. No, you're trudging barefoot over shattered thrones, sharpened egos, and the bones of disappointed children. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it there right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in ancient Rome, somewhere around 40 CE, and the air stinks of incense, sweat, and horse dung. You're following the marble footsteps of a man whose parenting skills could charitably be described as negligent, if not downright psychotic. Caligula. You've probably heard of him. Toga, sandals, massive ego, possible god complex. But did you know he once considered making his horse a consul, one of the highest political offices in Rome? You can almost see it. The mighty steed Incitatus, draped in a purple toga, chomping on oats served in golden bowls. And while this sounds like something from a bad political cartoon, ancient sources like Suetonius suggest Caligula was either completely mad or just epically trolling the Roman Senate. Now, what does this have to do with fatherhood? Well, everything. Caligula was a new kind of dad. Not the catch me at the Colosseum soccer game kind, but the I may feed you to the lions for blinking weird variety. He had one daughter, Julia Drusilla, with his fourth wife, Melonia Caesonia, and he adored this child. A little too much. He called her the child of my soul and threatened to execute anyone who even mentioned her in a way he didn't like. Romantic, if you're into obsessive emperors. Here's where it goes from, odd dad to, okay, let's call child services. You're watching Caligula parade around Rome with his infant daughter in his arms, announcing that she would one day rule the empire. Seems progressive, right? Except Roman society did not approve of women as rulers. Caligula didn't care. He proclaimed the child a living goddess, as if toddlers need more reasons to throw tantrums. But his obsession didn't protect her. In 41 CE, Caligula was assassinated by members of his own Praetorian Guard. They didn't stop with him. His wife Caesonia and their daughter, only a few months old, were murdered shortly afterward. Why? Because in the cutthroat world of Roman politics, even a baby was a threat if she had a claim to power. Historians still argue whether Caligula truly believed in his daughter's divine destiny, or whether it was part of a larger stunt to discredit the Senate and grab even more power. Was he unhinged? Or just using fatherhood as theater? Either way, his brief stint as a dad was as dramatic as the rest of his life, filled with extremes, delusions, and disturbingly shiny marble statues of himself. You pause in that Roman villa, the marble floors sticky with spilled wine and fear. A whisper from history slips through. Even the worst fathers can still be mourned. Now here's a quirky side note that almost no one tells you. Caligula also tried to declare war on the sea. Yes, the sea. He ordered his soldiers to stab waves and collect seashells as war trophies. Imagine your dad demanding you bring home a beach conch as proof of victory. That's the energy we're dealing with. So, you step away from this palace of madness. Behind you echoes the clatter of hooves, not just from a horse groomed for office, but from the stampede of parental failure in its most theatrical Roman form. You might want to tighten your sandals, though. Things are only going to get darker from here. You open your eyes, and it's bitter cold. Snow crusts the crooked streets of 16th century Moscow. Thick smoke curls from blackened chimneys, and beneath your boots, the ice crunches like bones. Welcome to the world of Ivan the Terrible, Russia's first Tsar, and a man who really put the no in paternal role model. You watch him stride across the Kremlin's stone floors, robes sweeping, eyes wild, beard frosted with winter breath. His stare is so intense it feels like it burns holes in time. This isn't just a bad dad. You're looking at a father whose name became synonymous with fear, paranoia, and one of the most infamous acts of filicide in history. Now, Ivan wasn't always this way. In his youth, he was shockingly well-read, deeply religious, even thoughtful. But that didn't last. A cocktail of childhood trauma, political chaos, and let's be honest, likely undiagnosed mental illness brewed a perfect storm. By adulthood, Ivan had turned into the historical equivalent of a rage monster. And unfortunately, his children were caught in the storm. He had 8 children with various wives, but only 3 sons made it to adulthood. Of those, one entered a monastery, one died in infancy, and one, Ivan Ivanovich, grew up to be his heir. Now, this son was no saint, but he was competent, educated, and perhaps the only person left in Ivan the Terrible's orbit who could speak to him directly without trembling. Until one day, he did. The two men argued. Over what? Historians still argue whether it was a military decision, the treatment of Ivan's pregnant daughter-in-law, or just a moment of built-up tension finally snapping like a frozen branch. Either way, you see it unfold in terrifying slow motion. Ivan raises his staff, maybe not meaning to, but strikes his son hard across the head. Blood spills onto the cold floor. For a second, Ivan stands frozen. His hands shake. He cradles his son's body, screams echoing through the golden halls of the Kremlin. But it's too late. Ivan the Terrible had killed his heir. And here's where it gets worse. The pregnant daughter-in-law? She miscarried from the trauma, erasing 2 generations of future rulers in a single moment. Ivan, who saw signs and omens in everything, interpreted the tragedy as divine punishment. He sank even further into guilt, paranoia, and violence. What's wild is that some scholars believe Ivan didn't mean to kill his son. The image of him weeping beside the corpse, immortalized in that haunting painting by Repin, isn't just for drama. There's evidence he truly regretted it. But regret doesn't bring people back. And when your dad literally clubs you to death in a fit of rage, it doesn't matter how sorry he feels later. From a modern perspective, it's like watching the most dysfunctional therapy session in history. Imagine your dad throws a tantrum during a family board game night, and you end up as a tragic footnote in the dynastic succession. As you walk the red-carpeted corridors of Ivan's palaces, the walls seem to lean in. They've heard too many screams. And there's something uniquely chilling about a father who ends his own bloodline with his bare hands. Still, a quirky little detail. Ivan the Terrible was also one of the earliest leaders to introduce a kind of postal feedback box for the people. Seriously. Citizens could drop written complaints about local officials in special boxes. Imagine a Yelp review for medieval Russian governance, except submitted by terrified peasants in the dead of night. It's these contradictions that make Ivan such a twisted tapestry of a man. Scholarly debate rages on. Was he a visionary ruler undone by madness, or a tyrant whose worst crime wasn't state terror, but intimate, devastating betrayal of his own family? You feel it lingering in the frost-bitten wind, the ghost of a father who became his child's executioner. It wasn't politics. It wasn't war. It was something far worse. It was personal. And so you trudge on, snow curling into the corners of your cloak, the silence behind you louder than the shrieks that once filled those golden domes. If history has a graveyard of bad dads, Ivan didn't just earn a plot. He got the front row seat. You find yourself in the opulent chambers of Whitehall Palace, the air thick with rosewater, powdered wigs, and the distant sound of someone being discreetly beheaded. This, of course, is the world of Henry VIII, a man who treated marriage like a seasonal sport and parenting like an annoying afterthought. He's the king with the most famous dad bod in history, thanks to countless paintings that generously smooth over his ulcers and triple chin. But don't be fooled by the portraits. Beneath that massive codpiece and fur-lined robe was a man consumed by insecurity, obsession, and a burning need for a male heir. You're about to spend time with a dad who was less interested in bedtime stories and more interested in annulments, executions, and political gymnastics. Henry fathered at least 3 legitimate children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, each from different wives, and each one destined for a throne or a throne-adjacent disaster. And here's the kicker. For all his blood-soaked marital drama, Henry was, by most accounts, a deeply detached and often toxic father. Let's start with Mary, his daughter by Catherine of Aragon. You watch as little Mary grows up in royal splendor, adored by her mother, a genuine prodigy in languages and music. Then comes the divorce. Henry casts aside Catherine like spoiled meat, declares himself head of the Church of England, and demands Mary acknowledge that her mother was never legally married to him. That would make Mary illegitimate. She refuses. So he exiles her from court, bans her from seeing her mother, and strips her of her title. At one point, she's forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her own baby half-sister, Elizabeth. No, really. Then there's Elizabeth, born to Anne Boleyn, wife number 2, who, despite her brilliant mind and strategic instincts, ends up beheaded for treason, adultery, and possibly glancing at the wrong man. Elizabeth was not yet 3 when her mother was executed. Henry doesn't even flinch. Elizabeth, like Mary before her, is declared illegitimate. You watch her shrink into the background of palace life, a bright mind hiding behind embroidery hoops and politeness. Still, Henry must have learned his lesson by child number 3, right? Enter Edward VI, his long-awaited male heir, born to Jane Seymour, Henry's third and, conveniently, favorite wife, probably because she died giving birth before she could disappoint him. Edward is raised like a porcelain crown jewel, groomed for greatness, surrounded by tutors, and mostly kept away from his father's increasingly gout-ridden tantrums. When Henry dies, Edward is just 9 years old and gets a throne but no father to help him survive it. Spoiler alert, he doesn't. Here's the thing. Henry wasn't a monster in the overt Ivan the Terrible way. He didn't bash in anyone's skull with a staff, at least not personally. But what made him one of the worst medieval dads was his emotional warfare. He used fatherhood like a chess piece, legitimizing, disowning, and re-legitimizing children based entirely on his current marriage status or political needs. Historians still argue whether Henry's treatment of his children was strategic statecraft or personal cruelty cloaked in royal protocol. Some say he loved them in his own twisted way. Others say he saw them only as tools for legacy building, just like his 6 wives and countless ministers. One peculiar tidbit: Henry once had a suit of armor made for Edward when he was just 6. It had a little codpiece and everything. A miniature king ready to take on imaginary French invaders in the nursery. Cute or creepy? You decide. Another weird moment. Henry forced Mary to sign a humiliating confession saying her mother's marriage was unlawful and that she herself was a bastard. It broke her spirit so badly that she carried resentment all her life, until she became queen and tried to torch Protestant England in one fell swoop. Thanks, Dad. You step back and look at the carnage left behind. A family scattered by decree, stitched together by political need, and emotionally scarred beyond repair. All 3 of Henry's kids would end up ruling England, but none of them would ever have children of their own. The Tudor dynasty, so desperately chased, so bloodily secured, ended within a generation. It's as if the royal nursery was cursed, echoing forever with lullabies that turned into royal decrees, kisses that transformed into death warrants. So while Henry VIII may be famous for his 6 wives, tonight you've seen him as he really was. A father who could split a nation in half, but couldn't keep a family whole. The winter wind howls through the palatial corridors of 18th century Russia, and your boots squeak against polished stone floors that echo with secrets. You're in the court of Peter the Great, towering czar, ruthless modernizer, and, tonight, a case study in how to permanently ruin Bring Your Kid to Work Day. Peter stands tall, 6'8" in an age when most men barely cleared 5'5". He strides with purpose, part warlord, part reformer, part walking hammer. You see the man who dragged Russia kicking and screaming into modernity, introduced the beard tax, yes, that was real, and once ordered nobles to throw raucous drunken parties just so he could mock them for being too drunk. But beneath the reforms and battles, Peter wore another title far less admirable: tormentor of his own son. Let's meet Alexei Petrovich, Peter's eldest and, tragically, most disappointing son, at least in his father's eyes. You watch Alexei grow up in a palace laced with fear. He's soft-spoken, bookish, and inclined toward the old ways of Muscovite life, everything Peter loathed. Where Peter saw a future of warships and European science, Alexei dreamed of monasteries and quiet. Not exactly bonding material. As Peter launched wars, built a navy from scratch, and moved the capital to a swamp, hello, St. Petersburg, he kept trying to mold Alexei into a warrior prince. But Alexei? He wilted. And that's when Peter's disappointment turned to suspicion. You feel the cold dread settle, because a father like Peter didn't just frown at bad grades. He saw disobedience as treason. Eventually, fearing for his life and desperate for escape, Alexei did something unthinkable. He fled. Not to another estate, but to the Holy Roman Empire, under disguise. Yes, Peter the Great's own son defected. You watch Peter lose it. Not the kind of go to your room meltdown. More like hunt him down like a criminal rage. Peter used spies and foreign alliances to track Alexei, who was dragged back to Russia in chains like a war prisoner. What followed was a series of brutal interrogations that historians still argue over. How much was torture? How much was coerced? And how much came directly from the Tsar's orders? Officially, Alexei was found guilty of conspiring against his father, a claim supported by suspiciously convenient confessions. Days before his scheduled execution, he died mysteriously in the Peter and Paul fortress. Official cause? Apoplexy. But even in the 1700s, that was code for "we beat him until his body gave up." And who signed off on all this? His own dad. Imagine that. Your father not only sentences you to death, but arranges it so that the punishment happens off the record, in a stone cell smelling of blood and mildew. The man who built Russia's navy couldn't steer his own family to safe harbor. One fringe theory? Some scholars suggest Peter believed Alexei would become the rallying symbol for conservative factions that threatened his reforms, so eliminating him was less personal and more political. But let's be real. When you have your son beaten to death in secret, it's hard to pin it all on statecraft. Here's a bizarre footnote. Peter the Great once performed his own autopsies. Like, a lot of them. He was obsessed with anatomy and loved watching surgeries, sometimes even performing them himself, because why not traumatize your court physicians? So imagine the kind of man who stares into a cadaver with fascination and still can't look his own son in the eyes without seeing failure. After Alexei's death, Peter passed laws allowing monarchs to choose any successor, not just their own children. A sort of legal shrug that said, family? Overrated. You leave the fortress with cold iron beneath your fingertips, the kind that once held the shackles of a prince who could never live up to his father's vision. And you realize, with a slow shiver, that there's a difference between reforming a nation and raising a child. One takes ambition, the other takes love. And Peter only packed one in his royal toolkit. You're now in early 14th century France, and everything smells faintly of damp velvet and political rot. The court of Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair, shimmers with grandeur. Walls paneled in walnut, tapestries whispering gossip, and courtiers who bow more often than they blink. But don't let the elegance fool you. You're about to shadow a man who could win the crown for most controlling dad in Europe. Philip isn't your average medieval monarch. He's strategic, icy, and beautiful, hence the nickname the Fair. But behind the high cheekbones and regal posture is a man who treats his family like a deck of playing cards, shuffled for political gain, then discarded when they stop being useful. He has 3 sons, Louis, Philip, and Charles, each of whom will become king in their own right. You might think that would make him proud. It doesn't. Because to Philip IV, fatherhood is just dynastic asset management. The drama begins when Philip decides to marry off his sons for maximum political gain. All 3 are paired with women from noble houses, perfect on paper. But that's where things start to unravel, and you get a front row seat to the royal version of a true crime miniseries, the Tour de Nestle affair. One day, Philip's daughter Isabella, Queen of England, yes, the same Isabella who will later help depose her own husband, stay tuned, sends her father a gift. 2 embroidered purses she had given her sisters-in-law have somehow made their way into the hands of 2 Norman knights. Suspicious? Just a bit. Philip launches an investigation, complete with royal spies and nighttime surveillance. Turns out, 2 of his sons' wives are having secret rendezvous with these knights in, you guessed it, the Tour de Nesle, a tower in Paris. They're caught, tortured, and forced to confess. The knights? Publicly flayed and executed. The wives? Their heads are shaved, they're imprisoned for life, and their reputations annihilated. And what do Philip's sons do during all this? Nothing. Because they know better than to oppose their father. He's not just a dad, he's a political machine wrapped in a velvet cloak. Even as his family implodes, Philip keeps a cold, tactical distance. His primary concern is how it all affects the crown. Historians still argue whether Philip orchestrated the scandal for political leverage. Did he want to humiliate his sons and their wives to consolidate more power? Or was he simply a rigid moralist with the emotional range of a candelabra? Here's the twist. After Philip's death, each of his sons ascends to the throne. one after another, Louis Philippe and Charles Ford. None of them rules for long. None of them produces a lasting male heir. And with Charles IV's death in 1328, the Capetian dynasty ends. You feel the irony settle in like winter fog. Philip spent his whole life controlling his sons, their marriages, their reputations. But in doing so, he crushed the very legacy he was trying to preserve. Now for the quirky tidbit. During Philip's reign, he had an entire order of warrior monks arrested and executed. You've probably heard of them, the Knights Templar. He accused them of heresy, witchcraft, and who knows what else, mostly so he could seize their vast fortune. Imagine having the power to take down one of the most legendary military orders in history and still not being able to keep your kids in line. Another eerie echo? Before he died, the Templar Grand Master Jacques de Molay supposedly cursed both Philip and the Pope, saying they'd both be dead within a year. Spooky? Sure. Coincidence? Maybe. But both men did in fact die soon after. You step away from the grandeur of Philip's court, its stained glass windows gleaming like frozen fire. Behind them lie ruined marriages, dead heirs, and a once glorious dynasty snuffed out like a candle. A father can build empires. But when he forgets to raise his children as humans, not pawns, the kingdom might not survive him. You're galloping across the Eurasian steppes, wind whipping through your hair, hooves pounding like war drums beneath the earth. The sun blazes overhead, and behind you rolls a cloud of dust kicked up by thousands of riders. Welcome to the world of Attila the Hun, and congratulations, you've officially entered the feral dad era of history. Attila, the scourge of God, the man who made Romans wet themselves at the mere mention of his name. You've heard the legends, the conquests, the gold, the rivers of blood. But fewer people talk about Attila's greatest failure, not as a warlord, but as a father. He had many sons. Some say 3. Others count up to 7. And still others whisper he had hundreds, thanks to a lifestyle that involved pillaging, concubines, and a worldview in which monogamy was about as useful as a screen door on a yurt. But it's Elek, his eldest, who matters most here. Elak wasn't just the golden child. He was publicly declared heir. Attila went so far as to place him in charge of the eastern territories and gave him top billing at tribal meetings. You imagine the awkward conversations between siblings. Hey, Dad, can I maybe run a province someday? And Attila's like, sure, when Elak says you can. Now, Attila dies suddenly in 453 CE. Nosebleed, wedding night, too much wine. Pick your version. They're all equally ridiculous. Some say he choked to death from a burst blood vessel while celebrating his new teenage bride. Historians still argue whether it was an accident, assassination, or an unfortunate case of blood and ego mixing poorly. Anyway, you'd think his death would trigger a smooth transition, right? Wrong. Within days, his sons, Elak included, start squabbling like feral cats over a spilled bowl of stew. The other Hunnic princes resented Elak's favoritism. You watch as alliances crack, tribes revolt, and what was once the most feared fighting force in Europe begins to eat itself alive. In 454, Elak marches into battle at Nidau to suppress the rebellion. Bad idea. He's up against a coalition of former subject peoples, Goths, Gepids, and others who are very done with Hunnic rule. You can feel the shift. The Huns, who once swarmed over cities like locusts, are suddenly outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and worst of all, leaderless in spirit. Elek dies, most likely hacked to pieces on the battlefield. Attila's empire dies with him. It fragments almost instantly. The Huns fade from history's spotlight, remembered more as a thunderclap than a dynasty. And here's the question scholars still gnaw on like dried horse jerky. Did Attila ever teach his sons how to rule? Or did he just expect them to learn by watching him scream and conquer? We'll never know for sure. There's almost no written record from the Huns themselves, just what outsiders like the Romans wrote. But piecing it together, you get the portrait of a father obsessed with dominance, but completely unprepared for succession. A quirky tidbit for your trouble. Attila was once offered the hand of Honoria, sister to the Western Roman emperor, in exchange for rescuing her from a forced marriage. She even sent him her ring. He interpreted it as a marriage proposal and demanded half the Roman Empire as a dowry. You know, normal in-law behavior. The Romans refused. But this tells you everything. Attila was not the kind of guy who saw marriage as anything less than political warfare. So when he fathered sons, he didn't nurture them. He bred them. like horses or soldiers. He passed down blood, ambition, and possibly an allergy to peaceful negotiation. But not wisdom, not trust, not unity. You ride slowly away from the grave of Elak, the wind dry, the grass sharp as knives. Somewhere out there, the bones of the empire they could have ruled lie scattered across the land. And you wonder, how do you train for empire when your dad only ever taught you conquest? History doesn't remember Attila's lullabies, only the war cries. You blink and the wind changes. Now you're deep in the heart of Central Asia, surrounded by endless desert, towering citadels, and the strange smell of horse sweat mixed with sandalwood. This is the dominion of Tamerlane, also known as Timur the Lame, one of the most brutal conquerors the world has ever seen, and, as you're about to witness, possibly the CEO of medieval family dysfunction. Tamerlane isn't technically a king. He's more like a military genius turned emperor builder, with a resume that includes the sack of Delhi, the massacre of Baghdad, and pyramids of skulls as calling cards. But tonight, we're not here to count his wars. We're here to peek inside his very cozy, very chaotic, and very cutthroat family. You see, Tamerlane fathered a dynasty, but not peace. His sons and grandsons were numerous, gifted in different ways, and, according to Timur, never quite good enough. You're watching a man who treats fatherhood like a gladiator arena, pitting his heirs against one another like contestants in a long, bloody game of who wants to survive the empire. Let's meet a few key players. Jahangir, the favored son, handsome, competent, and likely destined to rule until he dies young, throwing the whole succession plan into chaos. Umar Sheikh, brave but impulsive, not quite cut out for strategy. Muranshat, but unstable, literally. After a head injury, he spiraled into erratic behavior and bizarre decisions. Timur, ever the tender parent, demoted him and took away his authority. And then there's Shah Rukh, who ends up inheriting most of Timur's empire, but not until he fights off relatives who wanted the same chair. Here's where it gets spicy. Instead of choosing one heir and grooming him with care, Timur rotates responsibilities among his sons and grandsons like a medieval internship program, with live ammo. If one messes up, he's humiliated, banished, or worse. If one succeeds, he's resented by the rest. Timur's idea of preparation is chaos, paranoia, and just enough trust to keep them dreaming. By the time Timur dies in 1405, on his way to invade China, because of course he was, the empire is a powder keg. There's no clear heir, just a bunch of boys with blood in their veins and swords in their hands. You stand among them, and it's a disaster. Civil wars erupt. Cities burn. Some of Timur's own grandsons form secret alliances to kill each other off. It's less of a royal court and more of a family edition of Mortal Kombat. Historians still argue whether Timur ever seriously intended to name a single successor. Some say he loved the drama, kept them hungry, competitive, always on edge. Others believe he just couldn't let go of power long enough to plan for life after him. But here's the kicker. Despite the carnage, Timur's descendants did leave a mark. Shah Rukh held on to a decent chunk of territory, and his grandson Babur, yes, that Babur, would go on to found the Mughal Empire in India. So the chaos birthed new empires. But at what cost? Here's a weird little gem. Timur once took such offense at the decadence of the Persian city of Isfahan that he killed 70,000 residents and built a tower of their skulls, then casually invited his sons to admire it. Imagine your dad asking you to pose for a family portrait next to a war crime. That's the vibe. And yet, for all his cruelty, Timur was also a patron of scholars, artists, and architects. He built Samarkand into one of the jewels of the Silk Road, a stunning, radiant capital full of blue domes and carved marble, like a glittering mirage standing on a pile of bones. As you walk away from the turquoise-tiled towers, you think about the legacy Timur left. Power? Yes. Glory? Sure. But also a family so broken by ambition, their victories had expiration dates. You realize the truth of his parenting philosophy. Raise a warrior, not a son. But when the warrior becomes your enemy, there's no one left to carry your name in peace. You ease into velvet slippers and shuffle your way through the opulent stone corridors of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. The air is thick with rosewater, clove smoke, and the sound of fountains tinkling just a little too cheerfully, considering you're in the heart of the Ottoman Empire's most infamous child-murdering tradition. Tonight's feature presentation, The Fratricidal Sultan. And your guest of dishonor is Mehmed III, the 16th century Ottoman sultan who turned royal fatherhood into a blood sport. To be fair, Mehmed didn't invent the idea of murdering his own family members for political stability. That honor belongs to earlier sultans who realized, fairly early on, that brothers and sons make terrible roommates when thrones are involved. Enter the practice of fratricide, the legally sanctioned murder of one's brothers upon ascending the throne. It wasn't optional. It was expected. You inherit the empire, and the next thing you inherit is a velvet cord and a to-do list written in blood. So here's Mehmed, aged 27, crowned sultan in 1595. His first act? He orders the execution of 19 brothers. Yes, 19, most of them just children. Some were infants. You picture them in embroidered silk pajamas, still sleeping, as the executioners arrive. They were strangled with silk cords because shedding royal blood was forbidden. Practical, right? This wasn't just a horrible rumor. Ottoman court records confirmed it, and many modern historians still argue whether Mehmed felt remorse or simply followed tradition with the cold efficiency of a bureaucrat filling out forms. And before you ask, yes, Mehmed had children of his own. Many, and you can bet they grew up knowing that family game night might include plotting each other's murder. But the cruelty wasn't just downward. Mehmed's own father, Murad III, had him raised in isolation, far from court affairs, surrounded by eunuchs and tutors. This was standard Ottoman practice. Young princes were often kept under house arrest in luxurious but suffocating palaces called the kafes, the cage. Imagine being the heir to an empire and never allowed outside. Your windows barred not by iron, but by politics. Mehmed's own son, Ahmed-I, would later break tradition and spare his brother's life, ending centuries of fratricide. Why? Historians still debate. Some say it was moral enlightenment. Others say the empire was just running low on healthy male heirs. Either way, Ahmed's decision marked a turning point, but only after generations of royal siblings had been strangled before puberty. Let's linger for a second on the psychological toll. You're raised knowing that your siblings aren't family, they're threats. You can't confide in your brother. You can't trust your son. And if your dad smiles at you too kindly, you might want to sleep with one eye open. That's not parenting. That's state-sponsored paranoia with a velvet couch. Here's a strange little fact. Mehmed III was an enthusiastic poet. Under the pen name Adli, he wrote tender verses about longing, divine love, and the beauty of gardens. Yes, the same man who ordered a child massacre by strangulation also compared the moonlight to the eyes of his beloved. Sometimes history is so emotionally confusing it needs therapy. And if you're wondering how the empire handled the optics of all this, the answer is surprisingly well. The sultans were expected to be merciless if it preserved unity. To show too much emotion was a sign of weakness. Love your son? Fine. But not if he might take your crown. So when Mehmed finally died in 1603, he passed on a throne slightly less stable, a court filled with distrust, and a dynasty haunted by blood. His son Ahmed I would try to change course, but the damage was already done. The Ottomans had written fratricide into their DNA, and it would take generations to unwind it. You slip quietly out of Topkapi Palace. The marbled halls are silent now, but you can almost hear the echo of soft footsteps, tiny ones. Children leading each other by the hand, not knowing this walk would be their last. A father can protect, a father can guide, or a father can sign the death warrant of everyone who shares his blood. You're drifting now through the gray haze of a royal mind unraveling, wandering into the court of Charles VI of France, a place where the candlelight flickers just a little too fast. The courtiers walk on eggshells, and the king sometimes forgets he's a person at all. Charles VI, also known as Charles the Mad, ruled France from the late 14th to early 15th century. His father, Charles V, was a respectable king, sober, strategic, the kind of guy who made you eat your vegetables. But Charles VI, let's just say he had some parenting hurdles to clear. Namely, reality. You first meet Charles when he's still lucid, a promising young ruler in gold-threaded robes, loved by the people, dubbed Charles the Beloved. But that nickname doesn't age well. Within a few years, things take a sharp turn. You're watching him ride through the forest with his men when suddenly he snaps. He attacks his own knights in a delusional frenzy, convinced they're out to kill him. People die. His sword swings wildly. When it's over, Charles collapses, confused and glassy-eyed. This was the first major episode of what modern scholars believe was some form of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, and from here, things get worse. Much worse. He begins to suffer long spells of madness, weeks where he doesn't recognize his wife or children, periods when he forgets his own name. And in one particularly eerie chapter, Charles becomes convinced that he's made entirely of glass. He refuses to be touched. He wears reinforced clothing. He won't let anyone bump into him for fear he'll shatter. You're witnessing a king who cannot parent, cannot rule, cannot even function without supervision. His children, he had 12 in total, grow up walking on emotional shards. They learn to speak softly, stay still, and wait for their father to remember they exist. And yet, here's the twist. Charles had moments of complete lucidity, days, even weeks, where he was charming, thoughtful, politically sharp. Then, gone again. It's like being raised by a flickering lantern, warm for a moment, then swallowed by darkness. Historians still argue how much his madness altered the course of France. One clear result? His incapacity helped trigger the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, a blood-soaked feud that tore the country apart. His inability to govern led to power grabs, betrayals, and eventually English victories in the Hundred Years' War, including Agincourt. Yes, the same battle where English archers turned French knights into medieval pincushions. And what about his kids? One daughter, Isabella, was married off to Richard II of England when she was just 7. That marriage, understandably, went nowhere fast. Another child, Catherine, would later marry Henry Fess. Yep, the guy who defeated France while Charles was in a daze. Their son would become Henry VI, meaning Charles's grandson would inherit both the English and French thrones. So, in a bizarre twist, the legacy of a broken father helped seed one of the most volatile inheritances in European history. Here's your quirky tidbit for the night. During one of his saner periods, Charles insisted on replacing all his royal documents with new copies written on green parchment because he thought it would improve the kingdom's health. No one dared say no. And yet, for all the absurdity and tragedy, Charles's court tried to function around him. Ministers schemed, queens whispered, children were shuffled between wet nurses and political marriages. The monarchy became a puppet show with no puppeteer, just a glass man on a throne, surrounded by echoes. You walk through those echoing halls now, past stained glass windows that filter fractured light across the stone. A father who couldn't remember his children's names, who couldn't remember his own. And still, they called him king. Maybe the saddest part isn't the madness itself. It's the fact that no one stopped to ask if he needed help. Not because they didn't care, but because in the medieval world, being king meant always being strong, even if you were breaking. You close the heavy doors behind you, the court fading into shadows. In this tale, the worst father wasn't cruel. He was simply absent, a ghost in his own skin. And you can't help but wonder, which is worse, being ruled by a tyrant or a man who's already gone? Now you descend into the darkly theatrical realm of Spain's royal court, where black silk whispers through stone corridors, incense chokes the air, and candles burn low beside crucifixes taller than most men. The father waiting here isn't a raving lunatic or a battle-worn brute. No, Philip II of Spain is something else entirely, a cold flame that burns slow and deep. You've seen bad dads scream and kill and forget their children. But Philip, he remembers everything. That's the problem. Philip II ruled one of the largest empires in human history, Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, the Americas, even a claim to the throne of England, briefly, through marriage to Mary Tudor. And if you imagine a powerful Renaissance dad gazing proudly at his heirs across a map-colored banquet table, yeah, no. He was more of a sit silently and glare through an oil painting kind of parent. Let's zoom in on his relationship with his son and heir. Don Carlos, Prince of Asturias, had all the makings of a historical train wreck from the start. Inbred through generations of Habsburg intermarriage, his parents were first cousins. He was born with physical deformities, suffered head injuries as a child, and likely struggled with a range of mental health issues. He was erratic, impulsive, violent. He once tried to stab a servant in the eye for adjusting his pillow the wrong way. So, not ideal Crown Prince material. But here's the thing. Philip didn't respond with compassion, or therapy, or even exile. He responded with surveillance. You're watching Don Carlos spiral, and Philip is right behind him, watching every move. He spies on his son's letters. He installs informants among his tutors. He slowly isolates the boy until he's paranoid, frantic, and desperate for escape. Eventually, Don Carlos does the unthinkable. He tries to flee Spain and align with its enemies. He asks foreign nobles for help overthrowing his father. Now, whether this was a serious coup or just a cry for help is still debated. Historians still argue whether Don Carlos was a genuine political threat or a tragically unstable boy acting out of fear and delusion. Either way, Philip acts with eerie calm. He arrests his own son, locks him in a guarded apartment in the Alcazar of Madrid. No trial, no public explanation, just quiet confinement. 6 months later, Don Carlos is dead. The official story? Natural causes. A fever, perhaps, malnutrition, self-harm. There are a dozen vague theories. But no one, not then, not now, really believes he just died. Not without his father's signature beneath the silence. So here's the legacy. A prince erased. A father remembered not for rage or passion, but for sheer icy precision. It's like being raised by a chess-playing iceberg. And the weird footnote? Philip wasn't emotionless. He wept often. He wrote long, mournful letters about divine punishment and the burdens of rule. He spent hours alone in prayer, kneeling until his knees bled. He even built the colossal El Escorial, a granite palace monastery hybrid where he lived like a monk surrounded by bureaucrats. But if there's one thing he never did, it was forgive weakness, especially in his son. Philip would outlive Don Carlos by nearly 2 decades, and during those years he would watch his empire burn at the edges. Revolts in the Netherlands, failed invasions of England, endless wars bleeding the treasury dry, all while his cold, gray monument on the hillside loomed over Spain. A palace, a tomb, and a symbol of a man who confused control with love. You step away from El Escorial's shadow, the air growing stiller, heavier. In this story, the son wasn't killed with a sword. He was suffocated by expectations, by fear, by the unbearable weight of never being good enough. A tyrant strikes once, but a father like Philip strikes slowly, by withdrawing his warmth until there's nothing left but stone. The air smells of wet parchment, rusting armor, and something faintly alchemical. Welcome to late medieval Germany, where ambition, superstition, and family trauma stew in a Gothic stone pot. Tonight, you sit across the long table from Frederick III, Holy Roman Emperor and founder of the Habsburg dynasty's true rise. And unfortunately, a masterclass in passive-aggressive parenting. Frederick ruled from 1440 to 1493, which is an absurdly long time for the Middle Ages. That's over half a century of whispering bureaucrats, awkward marriages, and painfully slow letter deliveries. But in all that time, Frederick never really figured out how to connect with his one surviving son, Maximilian, a brilliant, bold, and deeply frustrated heir who would later be remembered as the last knight. Their relationship? A Baroque disaster. Frederick was cautious, deeply superstitious, and notoriously stingy. He avoided making decisions the way some people avoid bathtubs in winter. He even had a personal motto, AEIOU. Historians still argue over what it meant. Some say all the world is subject to Austria. Others think it meant Austria will be the empire of the world. And a few scholars joke it just stood for all excuses I offer usually. Maximilian, meanwhile, was everything Frederick wasn't. Daring, charismatic, risk-taking. The kind of guy who jousted for fun and liked to lead armies personally while wearing elaborate armor with custom toe spikes. Basically, the medieval equivalent of an action movie star. And he hated being micromanaged. You get to witness their finest moment of dysfunction during Maximilian's marriage to Mary of Burgundy, one of the richest heiresses in Europe. The alliance was Maximilian's triumph. It brought the Habsburgs vast territories and prestige. And how did Frederick celebrate? He tried to seize control of the Burgundian inheritance for himself. That's right. His own son lands the medieval equivalent of $1 billion startup merger, and Dad swoops in to claim the office keys. Maximilian resisted. The two clashed in public and private. At one point, Frederick refused to send money or troops to help his son defend the new territories, basically leaving him to fend off the French on his own. Imagine getting ghosted by your emperor dad while being invaded. And yet Frederick still expected obedience. He even delayed Maximilian's official coronation as king of the Romans, the step before becoming emperor. It was as if he couldn't stand the thought of his son surpassing him, even as age turned him into a dithering relic, more interested in astrology charts than statecraft. Here's your fringe tidbit. Frederick III was so obsessed with horoscopes that he wouldn't schedule important events or even meals without checking the stars. He once delayed a royal signing ceremony because the moon was in the wrong phase. Meanwhile, Maximilian was out storming castles and proposing tax reform like a 15th century Elon Musk with a crossbow. Eventually, Frederick died, peacefully, with a long gray beard and a mountain of unopened correspondence. Maximilian finally took the reins and transformed the Habsburg dynasty into a true European superpower, but not before he'd spent decades battling his own father's inertia and shadows. What does that do to a person? Maximilian became one of the most restless rulers in history. He wrote books about himself in the third person. He commissioned self-glorifying artwork. He tried to micromanage his own legacy as he lived it. Some say he was trying to prove he was better than his father. Others say he was desperately avoiding becoming him. You leave the candlelit study of Frederick's court with a chill, because the worst fathers aren't always cruel or violent. Sometimes they're simply absent in all the ways that matter. Not emotionally dead like Charles VI, not murderous like Mehmed III, just indifferent, distant, constantly calculating, but never connecting. A father like Frederick teaches his son that love must be earned. That approval is a prize hidden behind years of quiet judgment. That you can be a king, a warrior, a husband, and still feel like a child waiting to be noticed. You arrive now in a place where the castles grow out of cliffs, and the names come with far too many Roman numerals. Welcome to the world of Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible. And yes, before you ask, that nickname wasn't a historical typo. Tonight, you're stepping into the mind of a man whose parenting style can only be described as wielding absolute power like an unhinged bear in a church. Ivan ruled from 1547 to 1584, and he was Russia's first official czar, a title he took to with all the restraint of a bear discovering vodka. You see him as a boy first, young Ivan, orphaned of affection. His father died when he was 3. His mother was poisoned when he was 8. What followed was a childhood of isolation and courtly manipulation. Ivan was raised by boyars, noble families, who competed for influence and neglected the boy himself. So from the start, you've got a child with abandonment issues and a trust level set firmly at scorpions in my shoes. By the time he's crowned czar at 16, Ivan is already dangerous. But he also marries well. Anastasia Romanovna, a calm and stabilizing presence. With her, Ivan is softer, kinder even. They have several children, including Ivan Ivanovich, the heir apparent. But then Anastasia dies, likely poisoned. And something inside Ivan snaps for good. He grows paranoid, violent. He creates the Oprichnina, a kind of secret police, state terror death cult that wears black, rides black horses, and executes people with almost Broadway-level flair. One report describes them riding into town carrying dog heads and broomsticks to sniff out treason and sweep it away. Charming, right? Now you meet Ivan the father. His relationship with his son, Ivan Ivanovich, starts out standard enough, grooming him to rule. The boy is smart, dutiful, respected. But as Ivan ages and spirals into madness, things curdle. He begins to suspect everyone of betrayal, including his own children. He accuses his son of consorting with enemies, of plotting against him. You can feel it brewing like a thunderhead. Then comes the moment, November 1581, a domestic quarrel. Ivan notices his pregnant daughter-in-law wearing clothes he deems inappropriate for the palace. He beats her. Ivan Ivanovich intervenes to defend her. Furious, Ivan shouts. They argue. And then he strikes his son with a staff on the head. The blow is fatal. Ivan Ivanovich dies days later, bleeding and unconscious. Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar who turned nobles into soup and burned entire towns for fun, sits beside his son's body and weeps uncontrollably. Historians still argue, was it murder or a moment of blinding rage followed by genuine remorse? Either way, the result is the same. His most capable heir is dead. With Ivan Ivanovich gone, the only remaining son is Fyodor, a gentle religious man who lacks the strength or interest to govern. And so when Ivan the Terrible dies in 1584, he leaves Russia not with a future, but with a vacuum. Feodor ascends to the throne, but power slips quickly from his hands. The real ruler becomes Boris Godunov, Feodor's brother-in-law. When Feodor dies without heirs, Russia plunges into a period of chaos so bad they literally called it the Time of Troubles. Civil war, foreign invasion, false czars, famine, all because one father couldn't control his rage long enough to let his son survive. And here's your fringe fact. Ivan loved astrology, apocalypses, and theological debates. He'd spend hours writing religious treatises, often flipping from divine musings to full-on rants about treason and sin. He saw himself as both chosen by God and surrounded by devils. Which makes sense when you consider he once gouged out the eyes of the architect who built St. Basil's Cathedral, just so he couldn't build something that beautiful again. As you exit the icy corridors of Ivan's court, you hear only echoes of fear, of regret, of a single blow that shattered not just a family, but a dynasty. Russia would never be the same. Because even in the palaces of the mighty, all it takes is one violent second to destroy generations. Now the air feels different, lighter somehow, but the undercurrent of dread still pulls you forward. You're crossing the channel into England, and not just any England. This is Tudor England. The gowns are stiff, the smiles stiffer, and behind every polite bow is the threat of an execution warrant. Tonight's dad? Henry VIII. Yes, that Henry. You already know the headlines: 6 wives, 2 beheadings, and an ego the size of his codpiece. But tonight, you're not here for the wives. You're here for the kids. And let's be clear, Henry VIII may have been the worst father ever to build a dynasty that actually lasted. He had 3 legitimate children who survived infancy: Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, each by a different wife, each raised in wildly different circumstances, each psychologically scorched by the legacy of their father. Let's start with Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. For years, she was his pride and joy. He doted on her, educated her like a prince, even called her the pearl of the world. But then Henry decided he wanted to ditch her mom for Anne Boleyn, and everything changed. He declared Mary illegitimate, stripped her of her royal status, separated her from her mother. For years, she lived in exile from court, forbidden from seeing Catherine even as her mother lay dying. You watch Mary transform from golden child to bitter, suspicious woman, a transformation that will echo when she becomes queen and starts burning Protestants at the stake. Next is Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. She too was declared illegitimate after Anne's execution. You're keeping score now, right? That's 2 daughters disowned before puberty. Elizabeth grows up learning that affection is political, that love is conditional, and that you never trust the crown, because the crown giveth, and dad taketh away. And finally, there's Edward VI, Henry's long-awaited son, born to Jane Seymour. Henry loved this kid fiercely. He practically glowed with paternal pride. But, plot twist, Jane died just days after Edward's birth, leaving the child motherless and the king emotionally unmoored. Henry spent the rest of his reign obsessively planning Edward's future, smothering him with expectations and steering the court to protect his only legitimate legacy. Here's the twist. Edward was only 9 when he inherited the throne. Henry had created a regency council to guide him, but surprise, surprise, it quickly devolved into factional infighting, religious extremism, and outright manipulation. Edward died before his 16th birthday, likely from tuberculosis. He left behind no heirs. Just a 9-year reign where the grown-ups in the room were too busy stabbing each other, metaphorically and literally, to keep the kingdom stable. Now let's rewind to Henry himself. What kind of father was he, personally? Picture a man who swings between charming banquets and public executions, who writes tender lullabies for his children, then signs death warrants for their mothers, who lectures about obedience, then cheats, lies, and murders to get his way. Henry loved the idea of legacy, but not the actual work of parenting. His affection was theatrical, conditional, and weaponized. Historians still debate whether Henry genuinely cared for his children or merely viewed them as chess pieces. Some cite his letters to Edward, his gestures of reconciliation with Mary and Elizabeth later in life. Others argue those were political moves, efforts to unify the crown as his health failed and the Reformation threatened to tear the country apart. Oh, and here's a quirky tidbit for your trouble. Henry was obsessed with his image, literally. He hired artists like Hans Holbein to paint idealized portraits, so even as his body bloated and his leg ulcers stank up the palace, his likeness remained youthful, muscular, divine. He even commissioned a suit of armor so large it looked like a Renaissance action figure. You wonder what Edward thought, trying to live up to the myth of a father who weighed over 300 pounds, but still insisted on being seen as a warrior king. When Henry died in 1547, he left behind not a dynasty, but three damaged children who would spend the next few decades trying to outlive the shadow he cast. Edward would die young. Mary would become a fanatic. Elizabeth would become a legend, but only by pretending she had no father at all. You exit the echoing halls of Whitehall Palace with the image of a man who split his love into fragments, crowned one child, disowned two others, and called it dynasty. Because Henry VIII didn't raise rulers, he raised survivors. You step from the Tudor glow of England into the frosty palaces of Sweden, where the chill in the air matches the sharpness in the royal household. Here waits a father few talk about, but whose legacy left behind a very peculiar imprint. Charles V of Sweden. Stoic, paranoid, and the dad of one of the most complicated sons in all of European history. Let's set the mood. It's the late 1600s. Sweden is a northern powerhouse. It holds territory from Finland to the Baltics, stretching down toward Poland and even parts of Germany. But internally, the monarchy is wounded. Distrust simmers, the nobles are unruly, the country's coffers are paper thin. Enter Charles V, determined to fix it all with a little something called absolutism. You see, Charles II didn't just want to rule, he wanted to erase all the messiness of the court system, the parliaments, the noble privileges. He wanted control, so he created a tightly centralized monarchy and spent most of his reign building the kind of government where he was judge, jury, and sometimes accountant. And when it came to parenting, he used the same approach. Charles had just one surviving son, Charles VII, a bright, athletic, hyper-disciplined boy who rarely saw his father smile. The elder Charles raised him like a soldier in training. Every day, lessons, drills, theology, silence. No warm fireside stories. No play. Just the slow, grinding wheel of royal duty. And the unspoken message? You are the state. Be better than me, or else. You'd expect Charles VII to rebel, right? Wrong. He internalized every ounce of pressure. When Charles V died in 1697, Charles XII was only 15, but instead of appointing a regent, the Swedish council asked him to rule directly, and he did, like a machine. At first, things seemed promising. Then came war. Charles XII would spend most of his adult life in the saddle, leading campaigns across Europe, particularly against Russia. His most famous opponent? Peter the Great. And at the disastrous Battle of Poltava in 1709, Sweden's great hopes were shattered, and Charles's legend began to unravel. Historians still argue whether Charles VII was a tactical genius undone by bad luck, or a glory-addicted warhead who couldn't stop invading countries long enough to maintain an actual kingdom. But one thing is clear: he never married, never had children, never even seemed interested in building a life beyond war. Why? Some scholars point back to his father. Charles V raised a king who never learned how to be human, just a weapon. Even more unsettling, the younger Charles died in 1718, shot through the head during a trench inspection in Norway. To this day, no one knows who fired the bullet. Enemy sniper? Friendly fire? Assassination? Theories swirl, but there's no consensus. What's chilling is that Charles left behind no will, no heir, just a kingdom in crisis. Your fringe tidbit? Charles XII was obsessed with maintaining a frugal royal household. During campaigns, he refused luxuries, slept on straw, and banned dancing at court. Sweden had a teenage monarch, and instead of wild parties, he enforced austerity measures. Nothing says bedtime fun like a no-dancing policy. And back in Charles VII's time, the palace was a place of silence and severity. He was terrified of being betrayed by the nobility, so he dismantled their power piece by piece. But he also dismantled something else: his son's chance at warmth, at failure, at being a person first and a monarch second. You walk the stone corridors of the royal palace in Stockholm and feel it, the pressure like a hand always gripping your shoulder. You think of young Charles sitting alone at his carved desk, copying military treaties while other children played. And then you understand, Charles V didn't raise a son, he forged a statue. And statues, as we know, tend to crack, eventually. Now the lantern flickers lower, and the path draws you toward one final chamber. This time, you're not in a gilded palace or thunderous throne room. You're in a modest Dutch study, lined with books, maps, and quietly burning ambition. Your last father is Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, and the real tragedy, he started with good in his name. Philip ruled the Burgundian state in the 15th century, a glittering patchwork of territories that today would include parts of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Under his rule, Burgundy became a cultural and political powerhouse, with chivalry, art, and fashion cranked up to 11. Think knights in gold-plated armor debating poetry between tournaments. He was charming, lavish, exceptionally good at being adored. He was also, however, father to Charles the Bold, who, spoiler alert, turned out to be a human battering ram with delusions of military grandeur. And you're about to watch Philip, despite all his refinement and splendor, completely mismanage the one job that mattered most: preparing his son to rule. You see, Philip didn't just fail to discipline Charles, he actively spoiled him. From a young age, Charles was given too much responsibility, too little structure, and way too many compliments. He was told he was a born leader, a chivalric icon, a force of destiny. What he wasn't told? How to compromise, how to pause, how to listen. By the time Philip passed away in 1467, Charles had already developed a taste for reckless conquest. He believed he could turn Burgundy into a third great European power, equal to France and the Holy Roman Empire. But instead of playing politics carefully, he launched disastrous military campaigns. Over and over. And you, poor witness, have to stand there as he drags the duchy into ruin. The culmination? The Battle of Nancy, 1477. Charles, facing a coalition of Swiss and Lorraine forces, refuses to retreat. He underestimates them, again, and this time, he pays the price. His frozen body is later found on the battlefield, naked and half-eaten by wolves. Not quite the knightly exit he envisioned. Historians still argue, was Charles doomed by personality or parenting? Did Philip know what he was unleashing, or did he truly believe in his son's mythology? Some say Philip's biggest mistake wasn't failing to correct Charles, it was giving him too much too early, while protecting him from the consequences of failure. Here's your offbeat fact. Philip the Good once held the Feast of the Pheasant in 1454, a wildly expensive banquet where nobles swore oaths to launch a new crusade to reclaim Constantinople. It never happened, but the event included mechanical floating ships, giant edible castles, and a roasted horse stuffed with poultry. That was Philip's Burgundy: opulence, theater, and promises without follow-through. And Charles absorbed every bit of it. He thought heroism was just performance. That daring alone could defeat enemies. That legacy was built on volume, not wisdom. The world taught him none of that was true, and he died learning it. You step away from the smoke of the battlefield into the shadow of a once dazzling court that collapsed under the weight of a son who believed the praise and forgot the peril. Because even the brightest halls can cast the longest shadows. And even a good father can raise a terrible king. Wind down, 300 words. The story's quiet now. The torchlight fades from the stone corridors, the screams of battle dissolve into whispers, and the royal bloodlines retreat to their dusty tomes. You sit among the silence, heart slowing, mind tracing the lives of sons bent beneath the crowns their fathers placed, sometimes with love, sometimes with force, and sometimes with nothing at all. What do all these fathers share? They ruled kingdoms, but not their tempers, commanded armies, but not affection, planned for dynasties, but not for children. They taught fear when they should have taught trust, built walls when they could have built bonds, and in the cold wake of their ambition, their sons wandered. Some to thrones, some to madness, some to graves before their time. And you, quiet listener, you made it through palaces made of mirrors, through lessons written in iron and bone, through whispers of love warped into legacies of silence. It's easy to think kings were different, that power made them immune to ordinary mistakes. But no, beneath the crowns and ermine and velvet, these were still fathers, just men, fallible, fragile, often afraid. And still, children waited for their approval, their guidance, their warmth. Sometimes it came too late, sometimes it never came at all. Now, The castle doors close gently behind you. The halls echo only with sleep. Let the heavy robes fall. Let the candlelight soften. The worst fathers of medieval history have spoken, and your only job now is to forget their names for a little while. Good night. Sleep well. You made it through the darkness. End of script. Sweet dreams.